Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating, multi-layered broadcast from Victor Davis Hanson. We're going to neutrally break down his entire commentary, which covers a massive amount of ground. Everything from a proposed military escalation in Iran to the global economics of oil, all the way back home to U.S. election forecasts. Our goal here isn't to take a side. Instead, we're just unpacking the architecture of his arguments so you can clearly understand the exact roadmap he's proposing.
All right, let's take a quick look at our agenda for today. First, we'll cover the status of the conflict, then his proposed escalation strategy, followed by the global oil landscape, his predictions for the U.S. elections, and finally, we'll touch on the broadcast sponsor advocacy campaign.
Okay, part 1. Status of the conflict. A timeline of action versus inaction. Let's start with how Hanson characterizes the current, quote-unquote, war with Iran. Hanson kicks things off with a pretty massive question. Are we actually at war with Iran right now? He notes we are supposedly in the 134th day of this conflict, but he really pushes us to ask what that timeline looks like on the ground. Are we in a continuous, active state of war, or is the day-to-day reality a lot more fragmented than that? Well, when you break down that 134-day window, the contrast is pretty stark. Hanson points out there have been roughly 90-plus days of negotiations, compared to only about 38 days of actual kinetic fighting. For him, this totally exposes Iran's core strategy. They prefer to just talk, while the U.S. essentially wants to fight, finish the job, and get out. Because that negotiation phase gets dragged out for so long, Hanson argues it puts Iran in a highly advantaged position.
So right now, he describes the reality on the ground as this weird limbo, a state of no war and no peace. With Qasem Soleimani gone and key planners from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps removed, he says the remaining Iranian leadership is super fragmented. What we get instead are these sporadic, freelance, tit-for-tat strikes against Gulf states and tankers. But there's a really fascinating detail here. Hanson points out that these forces deliberately avoid striking Israel. Why? Because Israel has a very clear, established policy of disproportionate retaliation against the government itself. And Hanson claims that's a deterrent the U.S. currently lacks.
Which brings us right into Section 2, Proposed Escalation Strategy, the call for disproportionate force. This is Hanson's primary argument to end this exhausting cycle.
He is definitely not mincing words here. Hanson explicitly calls for a massive, disproportionate American response. He argues the U.S. has to stop playing whack-a-mole with individual missile targets or launch pads and instead focus on totally crippling the nation's fundamental ability to make war in the first place.
So what does that actually look like? Well, he lays out a comprehensive list of what he calls dual-use infrastructure targets. His strategy means completely choking off Iranian supply lines, hitting airlift capacities, Caspian seaports, and the overland rail lines to China. Beyond that, he advocates for shorting out the domestic electrical grid, destroying roads, bridges, and military barracks. The ultimate goal is the total neutralization of their logistical and military capabilities.
To really wrap your head around the scale of this proposed operation, you have to look at the numbers. Hanson argues this incredibly aggressive strategy is the only way to wipe out a 47-year, $500 billion military investment by Iran. $500 billion. He believes only a systemic dismantling of that massive investment will actually force an end to the hostilities. And all of that crippling damage sets up his ultimate exit strategy, which is a clear 3-step process. Step 1. Inflict that massive infrastructure damage so Iran is no longer a threat. Step 2. Bring the bulk of American assets back home. And Step 3. Leave a small residual force to help vested international allies, like the Gulf Council states, Europeans, Japanese, and South Koreans, keep the Strait of Hormuz open. Basically, his core thesis is that America's only true interest there is preventing a global recession, so the burden of regional security really should be outsourced to the nations who rely on it the most.
Shifting gears a bit, let's look at Section 3, the global oil landscape, shifting production and demand. Hanson pivots from military strategy to the macro view of the global economy. Going into this conflict, a lot of people were terrified of massive energy shortages. But Hanson argues that despite all the geopolitical tension in the Middle East, global oil prices have largely stabilized. And a major reason for that is a big shift in global demand. For instance, he points out that China, which is obviously a massive consumer, is cutting back its oil imports by roughly 4 million barrels. He attributes this sudden drop to China leaning heavily into coal power for its industries and rapidly expanding its electric vehicle market.
Now, to compound that huge drop in demand, global oil production is actually ramping up at the same time. The United States, Venezuela, Russia, they're all pumping more oil. Plus, critical pipelines to the Red Sea and the Gulf, which are located safely outside the contested Strait of Hormuz, remain totally open and fully operational. So, because of these combined factors, falling demand from huge players like China and rising production globally, Hansen predicts we aren't heading toward an energy catastrophe at all. Instead, he says we're heading for a global glut. That essentially means an impending massive oversupply of oil that he believes will radically drive global energy prices down.
All right, Section 4, Predictions for U.S. Elections, a favorable outlook for the GOP. Let's see how this global outlook ties directly back into Hansen's domestic political forecasts for the midterms.
Hansen strongly asserts that the midterms are absolutely not lost for Republicans. He looks at the Senate as a total 50-50 toss-up right now, which depends heavily on factors like Mitch McConnell's seat and potential appointments by Democratic governors. But in the House, he notes that redistricting efforts strongly favor red states, which could potentially net Republicans an additional 9 to 11 seats. Furthermore, he claims that high-profile Democrats in places like Michigan and Texas are pushing extreme agendas that are alienating voters. He argues the Democratic Party is being severely hampered by what he calls a socialist, Islamicist, and communist base, pushing policies that go against America's founding ideals.
And beyond the structural advantages of redistricting, he predicts a massive financial upper hand. Hansen estimates the Republican Party will have a massive spending advantage. We're talking between $100 to $200 million going into these elections. This is where it all comes together, like a giant puzzle. Hansen ties his foreign policy thesis directly to domestic political success. He argues that by using disproportionate force to decisively end the Iranian threat abroad, the Republican administration can completely clear the board. With the overseas conflict resolved, they'll have the bandwidth and the time to concentrate those vast financial resources entirely on bolstering the domestic economy and winning those midterms. Finally, to make sure we comprehensively cover the source material, Section 5 looks at the sponsor advocacy campaign from the Alliance Defending Freedom. At the very end of the broadcast, there is a seamless pivot from global strategy to a specific domestic advocacy campaign sponsored by the Alliance Defending Freedom. This message centers on the assertion that males have inherent biological athletic advantages over females. The sponsor frames this not just as an opinion, but as a recognized truth, pointing out that recent U.S. Supreme Court rulings affirm states are completely free to protect female athletes under both the Constitution and federal law.
The sponsor points out that while 27 states currently have laws protecting female athletes and ensuring a level playing field, there's an active petition to secure those exact same protections in the remaining 23 states. To really drive home the urgency of this, they use a highly specific and tragic anecdote about Kaylee Keeler, a high school wrestler in Washington state who was sexually assaulted by a male competitor during a match. The segment ends with a direct call to action, urging listeners to sign the petition at joinadf.com/Hansen or via text to side with what the sponsor terms truth and fairness. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought. We walked through a really massive framework today. From proposing bombing $500 billion of infrastructure in the Middle East to capitalizing on shifting global oil gluts, all the way to leveraging hundreds of millions of dollars in domestic elections, it is a cohesive, highly aggressive worldview. But the real question you should take away from this is, can a strategy that combines disproportionate military escalation abroad with intense partisan financing at home truly yield long-term stability, or does it simply set the stage for the next cycle of extreme conflict? Thanks so much for learning with us today, and we'll see you in the next explainer.